first of all, I'm delighted to see you all here today. And what I'm going to try to do is to be fair to everyone. And what I mean by that is some of you have read the book and some of you haven't. So for those who haven't read the book, I do have to talk a bit about the plot so you know what this is all about. But I don't want those of you who have read the book to be bored. So what I'm going to try to do is to, besides just talking about the plot, when I talk about the characters, what I want to tell you about is how I developed the characters. And I thought that that might interest those of you both who have and have not read the book. But I will say this, as much as I tell you about how I wrote the characters and what I think the characters are like, the professor, and I promise you before the question and answer session I'll explain to you who the professor is. The professor used to say, it's not the book you wrote, it's the book the reader reads. And he would say, if you sell 100 copies of your book, you've sold 100 different copies. If it's 1,000, it's 1,000. He said, because everyone brings his or her own life experiences when they read that book. So while I will tell you, you know, what I was thinking of as I developed these characters, so you get a sense of what a writer does as she's writing a book. I also understand that some of you may be sitting there thinking, oh, that's not how I saw that character at all. And that's fine. I definitely do understand that that's the way it works. So when we're going to proceed here, I'm going to challenge you all with a question. How many of you read the Rabbi Small mystery series? Okay. I loved those books. There was a rabbi who had to solve mysteries, and I loved him first of all because I love mysteries in general, but that book gave what the professor used to call finding none. She pressed her fingers to the victim's neck, hoping to get one there. Being unsuccessful, she began cardiac resuscitation. With the woman's crushed ribs, the sternum was right against the heart, making the attempt easier. Let me help. The woman's husband, also a physician, had run out of the house and was now beside her. She looked up at the driver, who was standing outside her vehicle shouting, I can't believe this is happening to me. I can't believe this is happening to me. Get your phone out and dial 911, the doctor ordered. She was so involved in trying to save the victim that she barely registered a tall, thin figure hurrying from the scene. Now, the woman who was struck by the vehicle turns out to be someone who is the president of a congregation right about the size of this one in Houston, Texas. But it's a conservative congregation. And she is Roberta Krause. And you might think, well, obviously an accident. But the woman who hit her was Lee Goldsmith, who had made it clear to anyone who would listen that she could not stand Roberta. She thought Roberta disrespected her all the time. And so right off the bat, the congregation gets divided. Those who think it was an accident and those who think it wasn't. But then it gets more complicated because Lee insists that either Roberta jumped in front of her car or was pushed in front of her car. So if she jumped in front of her car, that implies suicide. Well, as you can imagine, Roberta's family and friends are outraged at this suggestion. And this just divides the congregation even further. And you might wonder, why would she commit suicide? Why would anyone give her a reason? And it turned out she was fighting an end-stage malignancy. And that's how there were some people who were willing to believe that. Now, what about the idea that she was pushed in front of the car? I mean, why would someone want to push the president of a nice, small, Jewish Houston congregation in front of a car? Well, it turns out that she had been the star witness in an embezzlement trial. And it was because of her testimony that the accused was convicted. He was granted a new trial because of jury misconduct. And he was out of prison, and he knew that if Roberta testified again, he would be convicted again. And so he had even a further reason, which is he had a wife who was described as emotionally fragile, and he was convinced that if he were in prison, she would not be able to survive on the outside without him. So we have all of these possibilities, and into it walks Rabbi Deborah Stein. Now, I told you that I was really inspired to write this book because of the David Small series. But I had wanted to update it. And one way of updating it was to have a female rabbi, because we didn't have them at the time that the first series was written. And also because there's many female rabbis I know who I really admire. And so I had decided that this book would have a female rabbi. So I'll tell you a little bit about Deborah Stein, and then I'll tell you about trying to develop her character. After Deborah became a rabbi, she decided to spend 1 year in Israel. And she would just spend that time. There was a study program, but she fell in love with Dov. They married. She stayed in Israel. They had a son, Isaac. And then tragically, Dov was killed in a Gaza war. And at that point, Deborah just couldn't stay in Israel. Even though her son would have wanted to, she just couldn't do it. And so she wound up as a rabbi at a synagogue in California. She was only there 3 years, and she left and came to Houston. Now, Deborah has to be a character, on the one hand, who you like and admire for certain features. And Deborah, as the book progresses, you learn about all the times that she's been more than just a pulpit rabbi. She's been a rabbi who really, when anyone in her congregation has any sort of problem, she's there trying to find a fix for them. She's very kind. She's very devoted to both her son, who's now an adolescent, and also to her congregation. But the professor used to always tell us, no one is all good, no one is all bad, no one is somebody who's faultless, everybody's human. And so one of the things that you as a writer try to do is to make sure that your character, on the one hand, is someone that people can empathize with, but also, and sympathize with and like, but also someone they can identify with in part because of their flaws, because we've all got flaws, and you can't have a perfect character, or none of us would believe it. In fact, if anything, we would resent somebody who was perfect. So Deborah, we've already started to talk about some of her professional challenges, trying to keep her congregation together. But it's actually more than that, because the man who is now going to become the new president of the congregation never wanted her as a rabbi in the first place. In part, he didn't want a female rabbi, but in part, he was quite suspect of why she was leaving this congregation in California after 3 years. And we will find out, and this will be one of our subplots, although the minor of the two subplots, is we as the readers start to understand that she left because of something that her son had done. And so there is something there that's going on that we need to try to figure out. And so that's going to be one of our subplots. But mentioning her son gets us into some of her personal issues. And that is, her son is 14 years old, and he's somewhat troubled, to the point that the principal at his school, at his day school, has told Deborah she needs to get him psychological counseling. And Deborah finally does agree to this. But Deborah, again, for those of us who've had adolescent children, we know that, they can sometimes be difficult. And we know that sometimes when they're acting difficult, we wonder, is it our fault? Is it the kind of parenting we're doing that's causing this? Is that what the situation is? And there's frequently guilt involved when our children as adolescents have some difficulties. And also, when I say guilt, it's, we start to question, just like Deborah does. Am I spending too much time at work and not enough time with my child? What have I done wrong that's caused this? And so Deborah winds up having all sorts of doubts. She has feelings of guilt where it comes to her son. I think something that a lot of readers, because we want, as a writer, we want our readers to be able to identify with our main character. And also, as I think probably many of us did as parents, we did make mistakes. We sometimes acted emotionally when we should have acted logically, and acted logically when we should have acted emotionally. And Deborah does the same thing. But this isn't the only family issue she has. She also, her parents are Orthodox, her brother is ultra-Orthodox, and he has basically convinced her parents to not treat Deborah as a rabbi, in part because she's female. And so at the beginning of the book, they have never come to Houston to watch her perform her rabbinic duties. But Deborah, again, feels a lot of guilt over the fact that she has some anger towards her parents about the way they're treating her, some anger, even more anger towards her brother. And any of us who've dealt with sibling rivalry, I once said that by the time I was 45, I had gotten over my brother's birth. But not everyone can say that. So she also has a difficult time there. And then the other big issue that's going to come into her life is the character I had to create in order that we could get our twofer out of this. And that is Tom Johnson. And he is a recently retired criminal attorney. It was actually Roberta Krause, who was the victim of the auto incident, who sent him to Deborah because he said he had been raised with no religion. And now he wanted to learn about all the religions of the world, and Roberta had said, Deborah's the best one to teach you. And so he'd gone to Deborah. And so whenever he has questions about Judaism and Deborah gives him answers, we're all learning along with them. And we also get to learn about Judaism because of Roberta's funeral and sitting Shiva. We get to learn about it because the holiday of Purim comes up during this time. But the idea is I did want to give people a twofer. But in giving them a twofer, I gave them the major subplot, which is, it's not just that Deborah is helping Tom learn about Judaism, as this incident keeps building up and the police get more and more involved. And the police are going to talk to members of her congregation, and they come to Deborah and they want advice on how to deal with the police and how to deal with the criminal justice system. And Deborah turns to Tom for that. So as those of you who read the book know, and those of you who haven't read the book can guess, Tom and Deborah become attracted to each other. This is quite problematic because Deborah has always told her congregation, remember this is a conservative congregation, have all the friends you want of all religions, but when you marry, marry within the Jewish faith. And Deborah will not be a hypocrite, and she feels if she would actually start dating Tom, that she would be a complete hypocrite to her congregation. Tom, as attracted as he is to Deborah, is concerned that if they started dating that and carried on a romance, that it could ruin her career. So our big subplot here is, are they ever going to get together? And what the professor used to say is you need to have the plot and the subplot kind of come together right towards the end of your book. And so that's what I tried to do. And I'm just going to tell you about 2 other characters and why they were difficult to write about. One of them is the victim. And the reason that a victim in a mystery is so hard to write about is the victim is there for such a short amount of time. But you got to get to know the victim enough that you care about what happened to her. So we got a little sense of Roberta before she dies. We know that she was an efficiency expert, and being such in a company, and being such, she's somebody who tends to be logical rather than emotional about things. And Deborah sometimes has a situation where she's emotional when she should be logical, and sometimes she's logical when she should be emotional. But with Roberta, Roberta's pretty much always logical rather than emotional, which could grate some people the wrong way, but other people really respect that. But she's gone pretty early in the book. And so what you have to do as an author is her family and friends have to remember her. And that way you get to know her, hopefully enough that you want to find out what happened to her. I care enough to want to have about her. Now the other character who was really difficult to write about was Lee Goldsmith, who was driving the SUV. And the reason is that she is pretty much, she's really narcissistic. And she's just not pleasant to be around. But we have to see that, again, nobody's all bad. I mean, and one of the ways that I tried to accomplish that is she has a best friend who talks about how when the best friend's husband was dying, it was Lee who took care of her children. The rabbi references frequently how Lee has given money to the Hunger and Homeless Fund. She's contributed enough money to the congregation that they actually have something named after her. So we try to see Lee as not just all bad. Everybody's got something about them that you really care about. And I remember I read a book that was on the bestseller list, and I was discussing it with my sister, and I said I loved it except for one thing. There was one character who did not have one good thing about her. And I said, and that really bothered me. And I was determined that I would not do that with my book, that we would always find something in everybody. But I'm sorry, before I go on, let me tell you, I keep referring to the professor, so let me tell you the story. Professor Kulkarni started a novel writing colloquium at Rice University. And he had 6 levels. Each level was a semester. And then if you could make it into his advanced level. And what he would do is, after the first level, you had to go into his office, and he told you whether you passed. And if you didn't pass to the second level, then you could either get out of the program or you had to retake the first level. And he did this after every level. Well, fortunately, I wound up passing every level. And after the 6th level, he then invited some of us into the advanced class. So I got into the advanced class. The second day of the advanced class, he walks into the classroom and he calmly announces, I have been diagnosed with leukemia. I'm going to have a bone marrow transplant, so I'll be in isolation. He said, so that means we are conducting class at MD Anderson. And that's what we did. Instead of going to Rice for class, we went to MD Anderson for class. And I don't know how they do it now, but back then we would go out in the hall and there would be drapes, and they would open the drapes and there would be this big glass on the wall, just of all glass. And the professor would be sitting up in his bed, and he would have a microphone, and each one of us would read a chapter, and he did just what he did at Rice University. He reamed us up one side and down the other. He told us everything that was wrong with what we had written. He told us what we better do to improve that chapter before we went on to the next one. And he was just his usual self. So we were all just we were all just stunned when he passed away. We just couldn't imagine the professor not beating whatever was up against him. And so Rice University met with us, and they said, look, we don't have another class for you. I mean, you guys got through 6 levels, got invited into the advanced class. We have beginning classes. So here's what, but in honor of the professor's memory, what we're going to do is we will let you come to Rice University, have free use of our facilities, as long as you promise that you will conduct the class the way that the professor did. And that's what we did. We took up the offer, and what would happen is, whenever I read a chapter, and one of my classmates would say to me, as the professor would have told you, I knew that I was going to be reamed up one side and down the other. But it was wonderful. It really was. And what finally happened was, we had a 90-year-old member, and some of us saw her driving to Rice, and we decided it would be safer if we went to her house to meet. So we stopped meeting, and she published a book. Texas A&M wound up publishing it, and when they first told her they were going to publish, they said to her, it'll take 18 months, and she responded, do you know how old I am? And so they had the book out in 6 months. And what finally happened, unfortunately, is people passed away, people moved away, and but still, one of the members of that original class, who lives in Virginia, read my whole book. She said, send me the whole book, and she came up with all sorts of good ideas for changes I could make. So in some respects, the professor's memory lives on in just the way that, you know, we're ready to help each other. We're ready to do whatever to make sure that we get published, that readers get to see what we've done. But I'm sorry, I went on and on. So let me have a question and answer session. And again, I'm just going to ask those of you who've read the book, please, your questions need to be very careful so that we don't give away the mystery or either subplot, please. Also, I'm more than happy to talk about the writing process. My writing process is different from that of a lot of other writers, and I'm happy to let you know what those differences are. Whatever it is that, you know, anything I can do to help you understand the writing process, I'm happy to do that, as well as to talk about the book. Yes, Bernice.
Yeah, oh, it was a lovely talk, Judith, thank you. I read the book, and it was a page turner. I won't give away anything, but I wanted to suggest, I thought another character that you didn't mention was the city of Houston, and that was something that I really enjoyed. You know, I've lived here more than 30 years, and yet I learned a lot about Houston, and also it was very meaningful for me to hear about Houston in the book. So that's the first question. I want to have two for two.
Thank you.
Are you going to write a sequel?
Pardon me?
Are you going to write a sequel?
You know, I keep getting asked that question, and they keep putting it on Amazon, and here's where I'm at with that. I really am thinking about it, because when I started it, I was thinking, you know, this could wind up with sequels. We could have a whole, and I'm not going to start the book until I feel like I'm totally inspired, that I know the plot, I know the characters, I know the subplot. I'm just not quite there yet, but I don't, you know, I can remember, this was somebody totally outside my league, don't misunderstand, but there was an author I really liked, and I understand mysteries, and she had to, what I read about her was, she signed a contract where every year she had to write a book. And I was so excited, and just before I was taking a trip to Spain, I got a copy of her book from the library, her latest book, and I just couldn't wait to read it. And that was the only book I had on the plane, and it was, you know, hours. It was awful. It was just awful. And I've never forgiven her for it. And never read another book of hers. But I think the problem was, it was like every year she had to write a book. So I want to wait, and I want to see if I am inspired, And if I am, I will write another book. I'm getting, their ideas are churning. They aren't quite there yet. Yes?
I only read one of your books, Texas Justice. And I'm just, well, first of all, what made you leave the law profession to become a writer, number one? And number two, do all your books deal with Jewish people, Jewish topics?
Okay, well, I'll answer the second question first, which is actually my second book did not. And the second book was really inspired by, unfortunately, by a true event. An attorney that I work with was accused by his daughter's 7-year-old best friend of his having sexually molested her. And both he and his wife insisted it was the child's stepfather who had done it. And after about, I didn't know what to think. You know, on the one hand, you don't want somebody you know to have done something this horrible. On the other hand, you recognize it's possible. And 10 years later, so I didn't know which of the two men was really at fault. And 10 years later, one of them was arrested for having child pornography on his computer, and it turned out this was the second time he'd been arrested for that. And so once that happened, everything just spilled back to me. And I wound up just feeling like I had to write that book. And that book, it turned out, did not have Jewish characters, but this one did, the first one did, and of course the Stooge Gene did, because it's about my family. And what happened was, I have always been interested in writing. I mean, when I was a Girl Scout, I used to get merit badges by writing plays for the Girl Scouts to put on. I mean, I loved it. I took a class in college, but frankly, you cannot make money as a writer. Everybody misunderstands, and they think about the people who are, you know, the bestsellers one after another. But that's really unusual, and I'm just going to tell you a story. My daughter had a friend who was in a class, and the professor said, it was a writing class, and the professor said her daughter had written the Jump from Clausen's Pier, which years ago was on the bestseller list. And she said, everybody thinks my daughter, you know, made a fortune with this book. And again, if you do this over and over, yeah, you could. But she said what happened with her daughter was, it took her daughter 10 years to write the book. And she said that her daughter figured out that if she considered the number of hours she spent writing this book, that she barely made minimum wage over those 10 years. So, you know, you're not going to make money as a writer. I knew that. But there were just these stories in me, these novels in me. And what finally happened was, I was attending, Rice was through LaSalle. And so, you know, you could go at night or weekends. And I just really wanted to do more. And I was very fortunate because Conoco merged with Phillips. And then they had something they called the package, which you could leave, and you would get some of your salary, and it just seemed like the absolute ideal time. So I put in for the package, and I got it, and then I had time to really start writing, which is just something that had just always been in me, and I just had never had the time to do. So that's how that worked out. Yes?
I had a question. First of all, many artists and musicians never made much money in their lifetimes and were famous afterward. But you answered part of it when you said you'd give a twofer, and I was very impressed with your knowledge of ethics and customs and Jewish expressions, and I wondered if that's from life experience or you researched it.
Yeah, well, you bring up a good point. A lot of it really came from Telushkin's books on ethics. And in my book on Unkosher Death, when Tom first comes to Deborah, that's what she suggests he reads, the Telushkin's books on ethics. But you bring up a really interesting point, which again, going back to the professor always said to us, if you have you research before you start writing. He said, if you have one fact in your book that is wrong, at that moment, your reader stops reading and will never pick up another book that you read. And the book that I was just talking to Leah about, I spent so much time, it wasn't just research with books. I got to interview, because of some work I did tutoring children who were in foster care, I got to interview CPS caseworkers, CPS supervisors. I got to go down to the assessment center, the Children's Assessment Center. But the professor's words were there in my ears, So you're absolutely right. I read the Toulouse books before I had Deborah recommend them to Tom, so that if Tom had any questions for her about the book, I had already read it. And so, yeah, but you're right. You have to do all that research. Yes?
Did you already have the plot in mind before you started writing, or did you let it kind of...
Right. You're giving me an opportunity to tell you the difference between how I write and how a lot of other authors write, okay? Here's what happens. There are authors who do the most detailed outlines. I mean, they may spend a year writing that outline. Their outlines are so good that they literally sometimes have already conversations that characters are going to have, and they can just write them right in. Then there are people on the other end of the spectrum, and I'm not there, but the people on the other end of the spectrum who they start the book and they don't even know how it's going to end, okay? Where I fit is, I know how the book starts, I know what the plot is, I know what's going to happen in between, and I know how it's going to end. And I have the flexibility, though, of not having, to me, I like the flexibility of not having that detailed outline. And I'll give you some examples of the difference that would happen. Those of you who read the book know that Deborah and Tom wind up meeting together at a bar mitzvah party. And if I had had a detailed outline, I would likely have had their conversation already in my detailed outline, and I would have just plugged it in. I preferred to watch them and listen to them because of the characters they are. And I'm going to get a little more into Tom in a minute, but because of the characters that they are, I pretty much knew what they were going to say. But at that point, the characters were just developed to where I could just put it in, and I felt better. And Tom, I had to be really careful about, because on the one hand, hopefully you really like Deborah, and you want her, to have somebody, if she's going to have a romance with someone, you want it to be someone who deserves her. But again, Tom can't be all good. And so to try to, but we've just seen him at a certain stage in his life. So there are things he tells Deborah about that he wasn't so happy about in his former life, and there's at least one incident that he makes a decision not to tell her about because he feels that she would think so little of him. And so you still hopefully think he deserves her, but he's not perfect, but he does deserve her. I'm trying to think other examples that I could give you of what I do is I read a chapter before I go to bed at night, and I decide what my next chapter will be. But I figure, if I sleep on it, maybe I'll come up with something. And frequently what happens is I start to write the next chapter, and maybe I was going to introduce a new character. But all of a sudden I realize, maybe it's because of having slept on it, I suddenly realized we're not ready for that character yet. There needs to be more that happens before that character comes, and that character is going to have to wait a chapter. But there are other times when I think I don't think I'm ready to put the new character in, but then I realize if I don't put that character in this chapter, the plot is going to slow down so much that the reader might stop reading. And so I like having this kind of flexibility rather than the detailed outline. But people who do detailed outlines can't understand those of us who don't do them. You know? So it's a different writing process for different people, but that's mine.
But don't you have an editor who could move that character to another chapter?
Well,
Or-
with
You
this,
didn't self-publish, did you? I can't remember.
yeah, no, what happened was, I actually, I'm sorry, I'm probably telling too many stories here, but what happened with this book is, I had an agent. I'd sent him my work, and he called me up, and he said, I really like your book. He said, I'm interested in being your agent, but only on one condition. And I said, what's that? He said, you have to understand it's unlikely that I'm going to be able to find a publisher for your book. So I said, could you give me an explanation? And he said, yes. He said, yours is what we call a cozy mystery.
And what?
A cozy mystery. Some people call them comfy, but most call them cozy mysteries. He said, what is popular right now are mysteries with lots of violence in them, and or characters who have horrendous psychological problems. And he said, yours doesn't do any of that. He said, but I really like it. And he said, so my plan is, if you want me to represent you, I will try for a year. But if I can't do it at the end of the year, he said, then I'm going to stop. So I was so impressed with his honesty, I said, yes, represent me. So sure enough, at the end of a year, he hadn't sold the book. But he was one of the people who encouraged me to self-publish. So, you know, and I will say, in terms of, he wasn't an editor, but he did do one really great thing for me. He said, the only thing about your book that I think needs improving is, he said, the rabbi doesn't talk to anybody about what her feelings are, whether it's about Tom or whether it's about, you know, the incoming new president, whatever. She's not doing that. I said, well, my problem was, I said, I agree with you, but you know, as a rabbi, it's really hard for her to start confiding in people in her congregation, and people can start talking. And he said, did she have a best friend in Israel? I said, oh yes, Miriam was her best friend in Israel. He said, why don't you have her email with Miriam then? And that way she's got someone safe who she can share her feelings with, and somebody who can advise her. And so that's what I did. And interestingly enough, although you never see Miriam, we just have the emails running between them. But I love Miriam. Miriam is that best friend you're lucky enough to have, who cares about you so much. Any advice she gives is really just with what's best for you in mind. And I was always grateful for him. I mean, technically he wasn't an editor, but I thought that was one of the best pieces of advice he could have given me. And so that was really, really good.
And I like the secretary. Because
Yeah.
I've had two Lulus of secretaries. I wished I'd had a secretary that had my back like
Right,
that.
Margot does. Yeah.
And please enlarge, if you write another one, enlarge Roberta's, Deborah's wardrobe. 'Cause that's what she's trying to do.
I know, right. Yes.
Yes, can you explain a little bit what the self-publishing process means, and
Yeah.
how do you distribute if you don't have a publisher?
Okay, well, basically what I did was, rather than try and get the book and the cover page myself, rather than to do that myself, I hired someone who'd been recommended. Now the first two books, I had this publisher in Florida who took care of all that. So now I had to wind up with finding someone, and I paid someone to prepare everything. And the book is on Amazon, which you can get either in print form, or you can get
Kindle?
and for your Kindle, and also Barnes and Nobles on their website. You can get the book through them either way, and it's what basically wound up happening was, on the one hand, I had the agent who was encouraging, but the person who was probably the most encouraging to me about you need to self-publish this book was the person who'd been in the professor's class with me, who read the whole book. And you know, when I told her that the agent hadn't been able to sell it, she said, "You've got to self-publish." You know, she said, "You have a book people will enjoy." She said, "You spent all this time writing it." She said, "Go and self-publish." And so I went ahead, between encouragement from the agent and from someone whose advice I really respected, I decided to go ahead and do it that way.
How do you get it on Amazon?
Pardon me?
How do you
Well,
an arrangement with Amazon?
Right, I actually had her take care of all of that.
Oh, so you
Yeah,
hired someone
yeah.
that knows?
And she even helped me pick out, you know, what the key words would be, and to me it was worth it to have a professional
Really?
get it on there for me, so it would be in good shape. Yeah.
How long did it take you from beginning to the end to do this book?
It was a long time, I will tell you, but in between a lot happened. The agent wound up telling me he hadn't been able to sell the book just a few days before my husband passed away.
How long has it been since Howard
So,
passed?
pardon me?
How long has it been since Howard passed? How long has it been since Howard passed?
3.5 years.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah,
Wow.
and so, you know, there was a lot I was dealing with then. And then you know, the plague came along, and with everything going on, it actually didn't get published until last December. I finally got off my tush and did something, you know, is what wound up happening.
Well, you might not make a lot of money. You probably don't make a lot of money, but I think you have the most interesting job because you're researching and constantly learning.
That's true.
That's very appealing.
That's true. That's true.
What is your writing schedule? Do you get up early in the morning and write, or do you write during the day?
What I tend to do is I do tend to write. I like to write in the mornings. Sometimes when I was writing this book, because of the fact that I, you know, would sleep on whatever I was going to do, sometimes I would just wake up in the morning and I would literally run upstairs to my computer because I had all these fresh new ideas. So I basically tried to write in the morning for that reason. And there are days when you get a lot of writing done. And then the next day, you know, you come and you try and edit your work. But what the professor used to say was spend very little time on that, just keep writing. And then when you finish the book, go back and edit. So I tried to follow that advice, but sometimes I just would wake up in the morning and think of something that had to be changed in what I had just written. I just knew it wasn't good. But I would try to follow his advice. And so then I like to write in the morning because that's when my ideas were just really fresh. And again, sometimes I could go on for a few chapters, and sometimes I couldn't even finish one chapter. And it just, I can't explain to you why. I just can't. Yes?
Have you kept in touch with the other people in your rice program?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Have you kept in touch with the other people in your rice program in addition to this one
Right,
lady?
I would tell you, unfortunately, there's only a few of us left because we got started at Rice over 20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And so there's really just like 4 of us left right now.
Out of how many?
Pardon me?
Out of how many originally?
Well, by the time we made it to the advanced class, there were like only 10 of us. That's just kind of the way it worked out. But like I said, Linda and I have stayed in touch, and you know, we've encouraged each other and read each other's work. And even though we're far apart, we've been able to accomplish that. But and like I said, I always feel like the fact that we stayed together as long as we did, and still, like I said, I mean, Linda and I feel like we're still together. If I wrote another book, I would send it to her again, frankly. You know, I feel it, again, it's like the professor still lives. I mean, it's just,
Really?
you know, is kind of the way I feel about it. Yes?
I have not read the book. The shadowy figure you mentioned, so the car drive. Did we find out who that was? Did somebody push her in front of the?
Well,
read the book.
yeah,
Okay.
read the book.
Never mind. I knew the answer. Okay, sorry.
Sorry, you gotta read the book.
Right. Excellent.
Can't give that.
No.
I'm sorry. Okay, I don't know if there's any other, but those of you, if anybody who read the book, brought it and want me to sign it, I'm happy to do that. I have I brought a few copies in case anyone wanted to buy any now. Just let me know. Yes.
This would make a great movie. Is there any way to do it?
Oh, well, that's
How do you go about getting a movie?
That's a lovely idea. I mean,
You should.
thank you. That's a great idea.
I'm gonna have to run. It was good to see you. Over here, we'll get the other picture in the neighborhood. You got a back to Jason's. I like Jason's.